Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. So, when we left off last, we were reading The Tiger and the Wolf, and all of our characters were making a procession to the north so they could visit the Stone Place, where something big is about to go down. We're not entirely sure what, but all the different tribes kind of understand that there is something important in the world. And they need to go to the Stone Place, which is kind of the hub for mystic activity, to see what each of their different gods is going to tell them. So, let's see how that unfurls here with today's reading of chapter 23 and chapter 24. So let's dive right into it. Chapter 23. Where three rivers and the runoff from a score of hillsides met, the land was boggy all throughout the year, and the first melt of spring transformed it into a great swamp so vast and hungry it could have swallowed the world. No tribes lived here, though the swamp was rich and fecund enough that many came to gather and fish. And sometimes they died there, when the shifting ground ebbed suddenly from beneath their feet. It was said that the quicksands did not even let animal souls escape. True or not, enough had died there in their human shapes, smothering in the mud, that the swamp was crowded with ghosts. Priests traveled there to draw secrets from that buried motherlode of the dead. On some nights, even the least sensitive could see the lost souls drifting over the treacherous ground, glowing with pale fire. In the heart of the swamp there was a great island. No natural thing. It had been raised by the hands of men in an earlier age, earth set upon earth until they had conquered even the hunger of the swamp. Those ancients had raised a causeway towards it, a narrow processional path that was the only fixed and safe road through the quagmire. They had fetched the stones, the monoliths of bluish rock hewn from the mountains of the north. They had hauled them over the miles of rugged, broken ground, and they had floated them across the marsh, and then had set them upright on the island. Knowledge of whose hands had wrought all of this was lost. Every tribe claimed the marvel for their own forebears. Looking down the causeway's length to that island, Maniye felt an abrupt certainty that it had not been one tribe, but many. Somehow there had been a time, forgotten over the generations, when the peoples of the crown of the world had come together united. And, when they had stood together in one place, not even the earth, nor the seasons, nor the great spirits had been able to curtail their ambitions. They had remade the world. That thought came to her almost with the force of a physical thing, stopping her in her tracks so that Hesprick and Loud Thunder walked on a little, and then turned, each wearing his own frown. For a moment she felt that she had come upon an absolute certainty, although she could not have mustered a single argument to defend it. She felt that some invisible ghost of the marsh had whispered a secret truth to her. She also had no intention of exposing herself to the mockery of either of the men, and so she skipped along to catch them up, and would not respond to their questions. There were others traveling to the stone place, but not so many. This was not a gathering for all the tribes, just priests and their retinues. She could see tents set on the island already, in separate little huddles. There would be plenty of old rivalries there around the ring of the stones. Everyone would be very careful not to draw down the ire of the spirits, not to foul the coming year for themselves and their people. But, at the same time, everyone would keep one hand close to a knife hilt, while the priests indulged in their contests of magic, riddles, and lore. If the other two had shown the faintest reluctance, then she would have allowed herself second thoughts. Loud Thunder just kept shambling along as though he had not noticed where they were, though. His dogs trotted at his heels, with the empty sled dragging behind them. And Hesprick? Well, a change had come over the old serpent ever since they had reached the edge of the marsh. She wondered what he saw now with his priestly eyes. For him, Did the waters hold the empty faces of the drowned dead? Did the air glow palely with the power of this place? His spine was straighter than it had been, his head held high. A look had come to his face that she did not like, hard and cruel and old, in a way he had not looked before. Old like stories, old like the stone place itself. Then he caught her looking at him, and something in her expression made him smile and shrug, just the same old vagrant she had fled across the crown of the world with. But that other look returned once he thought she was not looking. What will you do? The sound of her own voice seemed an intrusion, and she felt the still waters soak it up and resent it. She needed to break out of her own thoughts, though. She had never counted herself as someone sensitive to the invisible world before, but their approach to the stone place was weighing on her in a strange way.
I must speak to my mother,
Thunder muttered sullenly.
but perhaps there is somewhere I can take you before then.
There was pitiful hope there, as he seized on any excuse to put off his own duty, but she could think of no answer. She had hoped that she might just tag along with him. Apparently, that was not an option. There are people Hesprick must see, she announced proudly, trying to show off at least a little reflected glory. Then she caught the serpent's expression and flinched from it. What?
Little one,
He told her carefully.
I seek the secret wisdom of the priests, if they will part with it. To my ears alone they may speak.
A shock of betrayal went through her. Then what am I supposed to do?
I would ask that you wait for me.
He had the grace to look embarrassed.
I am sorry, but you are no priest. These matters are deep and terrible. Happier for you that you do not know them.
So it's better for me to know that something deep and terrible is going on, but not what it is? Maniye demanded. Loud Thunder chuckled.
I think she is more than ready for your secrets, old man.
Hesprick hissed in exasperation.
If I go as a priest from the river, and alone, then perhaps they might speak to me, if they do not kill me. If there is any respect left in all of this cold land. If I go with the fugitive wolf girl, then they will see me as part of their feuds and rivalries and little wars. And they will judge me and close their minds against me, and I shall learn nothing, and they will have one more reason to do harm to me. I have traveled for 1,000 years over 100 mountains and 20 deserts and under the earth and all the rest of the nonsense,
Agreed Thunder.
girl. When I go to my mother, I will find you a hearth amongst her people. They will feed you and shelter you, while I do what I must do there.
Maniye took a few quick steps until she was ahead of him and could look up into his face. Why? He smiled a little, which was as much as he ever really smiled.
Why are you not dead in the snow, Many Tracks?
The words, and his using Broken Axe's name for her, made her skitter backwards until her heels were at the causeway's very edge. Oh, what do you mean?
Why are you not back with your kin as their prisoner? Why did I not cast you into winter's teeth after you outstayed your welcome?
Still he was smiling, but for a moment she could not read him or square his words with that expression. Then he made an expansive gesture, taking in himself and her and invisible connections to the rest of the world.
Look at you. How you will not give up. You will not go away. Everything in the world you take between your teeth and shake it to see what use to you it will be. You are a fierce hunter, Maniye many tracks. You remind me of why I went south when I was young.
She saw wolf tents on the island, several groupings of them. The sight had her creeping in Loud Thunder's shadow, almost under his feet. Of course there would be wolves here. The Moon Eaters lived close, and she saw banners that she thought were swiftbacks, too. And the Winter Runners, of course. Her home was south of here, but not so very far. Most likely Kalameshli himself would be present. Would he try to seize her, even here, under the stern gaze of the invisible world? If he could catch her alone, she guessed he might, but not as long as she stayed in company. Likewise, Broken Axe, who must surely either be here or be close behind her. They would have to wait until the gathering was over. She thought this, and then she examined her own thinking. Kalameshli Takes Iron was a cruel man, the tormentor of her childhood, the man who drove her before him with a switch. He would not be here alone. A handful of hunters, at least, would have come as his pack. Would he not just take what he wanted, as the Winter Runners so often did? And yet she did not quite believe it. It was the aura of the stone place. The air was thick with it. She could feel the tenuous balance of this place, and she knew nobody would wish to disturb it, to have it lash back across them like a bowstring. I am more of a priest than you know, old man, she thought, remembering Hesprick's dismissive words. There were other little camps, too. One was just a single ungainly tent composed of overlapping hides stitched over a round frame that stood almost twice Maniye's height. There were a couple of hearths set out in the open nearby, and some mounds of fur that Maniye assumed were just piles of hides. Then one of them moved, and she realized that she was looking at the cave dwellers. There were no more than half a dozen there, and all of those she saw were men. There were none quite as big as Loud Thunder, nor as tall as Lone Mountain, but every one of them was huge, nonetheless.
Old man,
Loud Thunder said, as they drew near.
you had best come meet my mother. If you are looking for wisdom, then she is more wise than any other in the crown of the world. If I ask it, she will speak with you, and probably not kill you.
How kind, Hesprick replied, faintly. They arrived among the cave dwellers in a flurry of dogs. As Matt and Yoff drew close, there were a dozen of them already on their feet and barking uproariously. Thunder's dogs were no better, the pair straining at the sled's traces until he let them run free. Maniye feared the animals would tear each other apart, but it was simply that she had never lived with dogs before. The yapping chaos was resolved as simple greetings, Matt and Yoff renewing their acquaintance with their relatives. The bear tribe themselves had a rather more reserved greeting for their wayward son. One by one, the big men stood up, faces closed with sullen staring as Loud Thunder drew near. Then, with shocking suddenness, they were all bears, standing tall on their hind legs. Many remembered then how he and Lone Mountain had fought when they met, and she stopped walking and started backing away. Hesprick was right beside her. Loud Thunder stepped as well. but did not slow his pace, and then all of the cave dwellers were bellowing at him, some dropping down on all fours, some standing as tall as they could. They seemed to be working themselves up for a fight, and Maniye could not imagine how Thunder imagined he might win against so many. He just ambled on, though, and they roared and shook their jaws at him, and yet none of them quite stood directly in his way. Then one got too close, and Thunder cuffed the smaller bear across the muzzle, sending it loping off sideways. The defiance of the others petered out slowly, until Loud Thunder reached the middle of them and sat down, blithely unconcerned, scratching at his belly. One by one, the cave dwellers gave up their show of protest, returning to their hulking human shapes and grudgingly giving the newcomer room. Maniye had the impression that the natural cave dweller demeanor was dour to the point of sulking, a people slow to demonstrate their emotions and slow to act. Looking at them now, the gathering together of such a weight of muscle and dense bone, she was glad of it.
This girl has my protection.
Loud Thunder declared, directing a broad hand at her.
The old snake, too. My hearth is their hearth. They are my guests.
That went down as poorly as she had anticipated, but now that he had arrived and established his place amongst them, his word obviously carried sufficient weight. When she moved to sit by the fire, they regarded her with dull curiosity, but made room.
Now, you wait.
Thunder advised the pair of them.
Now, we all wait. Mother will send for me, and she and I will have our talk at last. She will tell me how the world is going to be, and what it wants with me.
Serpent guide you, Hesprick said softly.
Old man, this is the mother of bears. She could break your serpent in one hand. Only thank your God that he drew out your years long enough to see the stone place and its business.
The snake priest lowered himself down beside Maniye and closed his eyes. She wondered if he was preparing himself for his own promised meeting, whenever that might happen, and tried to imagine how formidable this woman must be. Certainly, all the bear tribe were keeping a respectful distance from that single tent. Will you tell her of your stories of serpent? She asked Hesprick. The old priest shrugged his bony shoulders.
Who can say?
Tell me.
Stories of serpent?
Tell me what you came here to find. Tell me what you think she knows. Make me understand. Because the unseen was pressing on her eyes, and she felt it was trying to tell her something beyond her comprehension. But Hesprick just hunched his shoulders and began coughing again, long enough to leave him weak and gasping. Thereafter he was plainly too deeply lost within his own priestliness to have any more time for her, so she got up from the fire and padded over to where she felt the edge of the cave dweller camp must be. The sky was darkening now, and a little stubborn snow was feathering down to become one with the chill waters of the marsh. Little fires had sprung up everywhere around the island, save for the darkness between the stones themselves. A grand bonfire was set there, she had seen, but plainly it was for other purposes than keeping anyone warm. She narrowed her eyes, examining the other supplicants arrived here for the equinox. There were broad, heavy-set boar people, all layered hides and necklaces of teeth and tusks. She saw the long limbs of the deer tribe, a familiar sight to her. Antlers graced the brows of their priests, and at the neighboring fire a handful of them were stepping through the movements of a dance to the low patter of a drum. A handful of wolves passed nearby, and she forced herself not to shrink back. They were moon eaters, from their paint and clothes, and talking quietly amongst themselves. One of them barked out a brief laugh as they passed, but none spared her even a glance. Crossing from the other direction came a trio of eerie men, and there was a tense moment when one or other needed to give way, and neither group would. Then some unspoken accord was reached, and both bands took an exaggerated step aside, and in the space now between them was the secret of this place, the same spirit that hung about the stones, strong and wise and unforgiving. There were other camps, too, and in the growing dusk it was hard to make out who kept which hearth. One drew her eye, though, as if there was a presence at her elbow pointing it out. The figures there seemed to be warriors, armored in bronze polished to a gleaming shine that threw back their firelight. Somehow she knew they were priests as well. She saw gold glinting at their wrists, and, wherever the fire picked out their skins, it found them striped with painted shadows. People of the tiger, and a spark was lit in her then that would not go out. How long will you wait? She asked Loud Thunder. He shrugged morosely.
Always, with Mother. It is others who do the hurrying.
Days?
Most likely.
She looked across the island, sounding out her own daring. This was the stone place. This was the still center in the roiling turmoil that was the crown of the world. The voice of the invisible sounded strong within her. It told her to go explore, to step out from the bear's shadow. The island seemed alive with it, with a host of sightless entities that wanted her to move amongst them so that they could see her better. She could almost feel their spectral fingers trailing across her skin. At first, she meant to wait until morning. The sun was falling to earth in a welter of spilled red, and soon there would be darkness, with the treacherous marsh on all sides. And she could not sleep anyway. She lay there, with Hesperk's bony body curled up on one side of her, and the vast snoring mountains of all the bears around, and her mind was like a leaf bobbing in the waters, constantly dancing and dancing. It came to her then that she had no plan for the future. Hesperk's south was a fool's dream to hold on to, and one that the old man himself would surely never attain, let alone some vagrant wolf girl he might choose to bring along with him. It came to her then, or at least she finally admitted it to herself, that Hesperk would die soon. He was hard and stubborn enough to fend off the winter, but the crown of the world made all its guests work hard for the privilege of their keep. She had come to a place where priests of every tribe were peering into the mists of the marsh to know the future, while she just looked ahead and saw a void. She was a creature of the moment, fleeting and transient. She stepped to her wolf's shape and rose silently, slipping between the bulky shapes of her hosts and out into the night. At first, she intended heading straight for the tiger's fire. Perhaps, she had not totally decided, she would even walk straight up to them, show them what shape she could assume, show them that I am one of you. She imagined it all, daydreamed it in detail, even as she left the bear's hearth. She assured herself that it would feel like to step from under the wolf's shadow and into the embrace of a different god. Even while she wore the wolf's own shape, she thought it. Perhaps that was why her feet led her astray. Despite the fires, it was very dark in the stone place. Above her, the stars were shrouded, mocking those below who might seek to fish the future from their pond. Her wolf nose was battered by a multitude of scents, the bodies, fires, and food of a dozen tribes. Abruptly, she found that she could not tell which of the leaping lights of the island were nearby, and which were all the way across it. Trying to shake off her uncertainty, she pushed forwards with a sudden flurry of speed. Ever since leaving the Winter Runners, she had raced through the world as though distance itself was a cure for all ills, and now it betrayed her. Abruptly the land was clear on either side, just the packed earth of this artificial hill, and then there were the stones. They rose above her, to the left and to the right, great dark sentinels that she sensed more than saw. In a convulsive moment she felt as if something had gripped hold of her, intangible and irresistible, stripping her skin from her, nose to tail. A moment later she was in her tiger shape, its keener eyes harvesting distant firelight so as to make out the tall, still monoliths rising before her. For a brief moment she felt that the wolf was gone, totally gone, and scrabbled with unexpected panic within her, searching out all its old haunts, one by one. Then she had it again, cowering at the very back of her mind, while the tiger in her was so bold. She had almost run straight inside the circle of stones. She had almost crossed into the eye of the stone place, where the spirits watched all the time. Only priests went there, and, though she had pretended to herself that she felt like a priest, now she knew she was nothing but a fugitive girl. If she had taken another handful of steps, who could know? But she would be marked forever. To stand before the greater spirits, even a priest must purify himself and sacrifice and beg. Her eyes caught the approach of more lights, a line of torches emerging from one of the camps, and she froze, torn between the desires to flee and to spy. Their own fires picked them out for her, and her tiger's heart jumped, for it was her people, her own people, the ones she had never known. A woman led them, who wore mail of bronze squares and an ornate helm with a feathered crest. The skin of her cheeks was raised in thin lines that the torchlight turned into dancing shadow stripes. Behind her followed two men, their faces solemn. They had some of the look of the people Maniye had grown up with, but with something else as well. Their eyes were angled, their faces longer. There was a mystery written into them. To Maniye, they were beautiful. She followed their progress, crouching close to the base of the closest stone. They were tracing a curving path, and she knew they were making for some special point, some invisible path known only to the tiger, by which the circle could be entered. Turning to keep them in view, she realized her error. She traced the line of the stones with her eyes. The circle was simple, just a ring of irregular jutting fingers with a single squat altar in its very center. As the torches neared, many of the stones leapt into relief, casting their shifting shadows across the ground, across the circle that they enclosed. The circle that she was inside. She had bounded straight into it, and only been brought to a halt by the stones on the far side. She knew then that it was the coming of the tiger to these stones that had stepped her into this shape. If she had just been some hapless wolf girl, then surely she would have been punished, struck blind, driven mad, killed on the spot. The spirits could do such things. With this new knowledge, though, she could not stay. Half belong as she might, she could not trespass within the circle during a tiger ritual. There was reckless, and then there was outright foolhardy. She held her breath as she backed out between the stones, between the same two pillars that she'd thought had been keeping her from going in. Casting a glance behind her, she saw the three tigers now enter the circle, their priestess at the fore. Moving further away, she could see no more. Her eyes caught a deeper darkness between the fire, and after a moment she identified it. Spies. Other spies. Of course, any who chose to look up the hill towards the stones might see something of what passed between the tiger and their god, but these, whoever these were, they had drawn closer. Still clad in her tiger shape, she circled them, closing carefully, wondering who it was that took such an interest in her people. Yet, who else but her other people? She stopped dead still because she had recognized a face she knew. Yes, yes, there was Kalameshli takes iron, and the sight of him sent a jolt of fear and hatred through her, a short lifetime's worth of taunts and goads flurrying through her head like snow. A moment later, he was almost forgotten, though. Akrit Stone River was here, too. He knelt on the ground, a man with patience to spare, and stared at the stones and the three votaries within. The two Shadow Eater men were singing now, one low and one high, an eerie counterpoint that seemed to rise up into the clouded sky and resonate through the earth. Their torchlight barely touched Akrit's eyes, lurking there as the faintest of angry embers. She began to back away. Their attention was fixed on the ritual. The spirits had blessed her this much, that she had spotted them first. It was the fur of her flanks that told her of the other, not her nose, nor eyes, nor ears. When she twitched away from him, he was close enough to reach out and take her by the scruff of the neck. Broken Axe regarded her expressionlessly. No, not quite. There was a slight twitch to his lips, a token amusement at having found her yet again. She had frozen in shock, and she saw his eyes flick towards the gathering of wolves and to the tiger ritual beyond. A shout from him would bring Akrit and Kalameshli both down on her back. She was caught, helpless and immobile, torn between leaping and fleeing. Then that seed of a smile grew a little, and he shrugged and turned away, strolling over towards the other wolves, not a hint of hurry in his steps. She fled then, but he never called the alarm, and her father never knew she had been there. That concludes chapter 23. So, Maniye, Loud Thunder, and Hesperik all make it to the stone place. Maniye goes off at night, ends up accidentally spying on the tiger people, and has her tiger form forced out of her. The power of the tiger ritual basically evoked her tiger spirit against her will. And at the very end there, Broken Axe was right beside her. He had followed her the whole way. But he didn't seem to take much an interest in her. So we can speculate as to why. Very interesting. But let's see what happens in chapter 24. The tiger ritual had been disconcerting. A familiar message, yet written in an alien tongue. The woman who stood in for their priest, and her two eunuch servants, they had gone through strange steps, made unfamiliar offerings, and yet Akrit felt he understood. Watching from out in the dark, he had seen an urgency in these motions, an invocation of martial preparedness. The tiger tribe, too, were readying for conflict.
There is a time coming,
Kalameshli confirmed later.
the spirits speak of it. My dreams, the dreams of many priests here, are disturbed by it. So the tiger hear the same voices. They do not know your plans.
Akrit had never concerned himself that the tiger might be readying themselves to defend against him. He was struck by the sudden thought that his own plan, the plan he had been nursing all these years, might not be his plan at all. What if it had merely been gods and spirits working through him? He knew many who might be proud of playing such a role, but not he. Akrit Stone River was, above all, his own master. The wolf wished no cringing thralls amongst those born in his shadow. The morning after, and keyed up by Kalameshli's words, he went to speak with the priests of the Moon Eaters, who were here in force. He needed to present himself to them, to win their blessing. He needed to have them thinking of him as the next High Chief. And yet, when he reached them, it seemed he was a man come second to the feast. The hard, derisive eyes of water gathers stared out at him from the midst of the priests.
Stone River,
Began the son of Seven Skins.
who would have thought to find you here? What purpose can you have so far from home?
Catches the Moon, the young priest of the Many Mouths, was lurking in his shadow, and there were plenty of sidelong glances shared between the Moon Eaters.
I have told these wise men of the passing of my father.
Water Gathers explained expansively.
All agree he departed from this tribe as a strong man. A warrior should. He did,
Stone River agreed.
he was a man we shall not see again for a generation. Would that more were like him.
The twitch at the corner of Water Gather's mouth was slight, and utterly unamused.
I have told them also of my father's last words to me, how he bid me follow in his tracks, how he marked me for greatness. I am my father's son, his heart, his all. I was his joy when he still lived amongst us. To see me in my strength was what gave him the strength to leave his people in my care. So much he told you.
Akrit could sense Kalameshli right behind him, the old man urging him silently to hold his temper.
And yet I gusted with your brother, a fine man and a wise one, and it seems your father had not said a word of this to him. My brother Otayo is no hunter,
Water Gathers replied, contemptuously.
He brought my father neither joy nor solace by tending hearth while his mate sought prey.
They are already more with him than with me, Akrit thought, letting his peripheral vision inform him of the Moon Eater's disposition, even as he kept his eyes fixed squarely on his opponent. He knew what he wanted to say, and also he knew that these words could never be taken back. They would fan the hatred of Water Gatherers into a high burning fire that might consume either or both of them. And he realized that he was going to say them anyway. He was losing face moment to moment. No man would follow a high chief who turned his back.
I, too, spoke with your father before his passing,
Akrit said softly, making them lean in to hear more clearly.
It is true he said much of you. You were uppermost in his thoughts. But he was also my friend, my teacher, like unto my own father. We began the rising against the tiger that drove them into the high places, and we finished it, he and I. Who else can boast the same that lives now?
Not Water Gatherers, certainly.
He spoke fondly of Otayo, but, like you, he lamented your brother's choice to keep a home rather than to lead the hunt. For, if your brother had taken up the bow and the spear, your father could not have to lament your becoming chief of the many mouths.
The Moon Eaters had gone quiet and still, recognizing that moment in a fight where wrestling and blows are no longer enough, and the knives are drawn.
He was a honed blade, your father. Even in his last days he had a keen edge to him. Even sick, he was a man I would follow into the fire. And you are no blade, but a maul. You are a blunt striker without wisdom or subtlety. You are not the man to follow Maninli Seven Skins.
The words struck home like arrows, but Water Gatherers was still standing firm, braced against them. There was only one brief moment when his mask cracked, and Akrit could see into his soul. He saw there more self-knowledge than he had expected. He saw that Water Gatherers knew all of what his father had thought of him, and that becoming High Chief in Maninli's place was the only way he could erase the burning venom of that knowledge.
And yet I am a man,
Water Gatherers spat.
I say my father loved me, and he saw himself in me, and in my sons, Stone River, my sons who shall carry the blood of Seven Skins down to their own sons. We have heard the wind of your words. Now, show us your sons. Show us what the loins of the winter runners can fruit.
I will show you, snarled Akrit, and yet he had none, and not even the girl to bring before them. And if he had her, he'd tell them precisely what he would bring for the wolf, with her at his side. If he had her, he'd have her here to beat them with. Only if. Amongst the stones was a bad place to be, Asmander had decided. They all felt it, the northern spirits of place bending their gaze upon the three travelers. Shiri was skittish, jumping at shadows. Venator brooded and glowered, his flinty eyes stabbing out at anyone who looked his way, meeting the savagery of the north with savagery of his own. A spirit place. And of course, the Riverlands had such places of their own, but most of them had been built upon, weighed down with stone and garlanded with priests until they became something else, something that was a part of the Sun River Nation. Asmander had no sense that this place was a part of the crown of the world in the same way, if for no other reason than there was no single crown of the world. Just like the plains, this was a fragmented place where men had never learned to live together. And, just like the plains, it was a foolhardy place to venture unprepared. Asmander felt unprepared. He had come to treat with the heart of the North, but found it had no heart. The invisible presence that swathed this place like a miasma and pricked up the hairs on his arms was a divided and many-faced monster. The two coyote had left them as soon as they crossed the causeway, as though being seen with the Southerners would be bad for their reputations. The pair were priests, he had realized. All this time traveling with them, thinking of them as itinerant peddlers, when they had come here for their own devotions. Asmander tried to work out just who had used whom the most in getting here.
Wishing you'd not come?
Venator's rough tone grated in his ear.
The lucky man's wishes are ignored by the world. The luckless man's are granted,
Asmander replied, the old saying falling from his lips by rote.
You'll go hunting this stone river, even if he's here?
He's here, Shiri's voice broke in. I saw one of his people, one of his warriors from the wolf place, and he was watching us.
We cut such fine figures. Who would not?
Asmander remarked dryly. The three of them were indeed attracting a lot of attention. Leather-skinned northerners stared at them as though they were ill-loved figures from legend, stopping in their tracks to glower at the three travelers. More than that, though, there was a constant pressure about them, a flexing of the air, a bristling of the ground. The stone place did not know them. The stone place did not like them.
First things first, we will set a fire, Asmander directed. In the morning, we shall see what we can accomplish.
He looked up at the lowering sky, feeling that same great presence bear down on him. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to run. He wanted to shed his human form. I will not perform for you, he whispered. The next morning he woke slowly. Whatever the northern spring might be like, the world was still bitterly cold, and none of the horse society's gifted clothing could change that. The fire had died, and the three of them had been huddled close together, Shiri curled into him, and Venator's broad back against his own. He had not slept well, waking often to stare up at a sky full of scudding clouds, at the cold and distant constellations. He could pick out plenty that he had a name for, but they seemed different here, refusing to acknowledge him. This was a northern sky, and, like the stones, it did not know him. And he knew that the local people would be the same, unless he did something about it. If he just went from hearth to hearth and badgered them for aid, then it would not matter what he promised them. He first needed to cut himself a place in their world, and not just the craggy, boggy, freezing hell that was the crown of the world. He needed to engage with the world of their traditions and their observances. He needed to touch the invisible here at the stone place. With a chill, clouded dawn clawing at the eastern sky like a corpse from its grave, he kicked the other two awake.
I am about to do something reckless, he informed them.
What's new? Venator responded promptly, but the old pirate's eyes flicked towards the jutting fingers of the stones, and Asmander nodded.
What if you die of it?
He asked. Not quite an angry demand, yet certainly nothing as human as concern.
If the locals kill me, I expect you both to go down valiantly before their blades in an attempt to prolong my life, Asmander told him, eliciting a snort of derision. If I am struck down or driven mad or whatever by the powers here, then you're just plain out of luck, child of Venet. You're serious? You're going to piss on their gods? Shiri demanded. What? No! Asmander snapped back. That is how you go about things on the plains, is it? Certainly it is. We find a holy place of another tribe, piss on it's the least we do. How else to keep our enemies' gods weak? Asmander shook his head. Well, thank you. Suddenly this desolate place seems somehow more civilized in comparison. He was about to go marching off towards the stones when she snagged his shoulder. Wear this. It was a necklace of polished discs, weirdly textured. He had seen it on her sometimes. She had a bag of similar pieces and swapped between them, for unspoken reasons of her own. If this is another pissing contest thing, then I won't. This was passed to me from my mother, my real mother, and she had it from hers. The horns from which it is cut belonged to a tribe wiped from the plains in the story times, the long ago times. Like the aurochs, they have gone back to their beasts, and my people drove them to it. So, this is strength, this trinket. This is triumph. I lend you the strength of the laughing men through all the years. We know no masters, and there is nothing we will not do. That is our creed. Wear this, and carry our strength to the northern gods. Genuinely touched, Asmander took the cord and looped it over his head. The horn discs were an unfamiliar burden on his chest, heavy in a way their mere weight could not account for. That is a fine creed, girl, Venator said softly. One your people would recognize, Asmander noted, and the pirate nodded solemnly. Then it was time. The sun was dragging itself clear of the horizon, a finger's breadth at a time, as Asmander strode towards the stark pillars at the heart of the island. The other two fell in behind him, and, both at once and yet with no spoken signal, they stepped, so that he approached the heart of the north with a spotted hyena padding to his left, and a sprawling, whip-tailed dragon on his right, the dawn light glittering on its black scales. They stopped on reaching the stones themselves, though. It was only Asmander who stepped through into that circular space, to drop to his knees before the altar. By then, a great many eyes were fixed on him. He bowed his head, not in reverence, but merely as an aid to concentration. With his eyes closed, he could feel the hostility surging in on him in waves from all sides, from every stone. It was not a personal dislike, not the price of anything he had done. It was the place itself, reacting to the child of another land, of different gods. So, here I am, he addressed the stones in his mind, with only thoughts. I am the first son of Asman, but that will mean nothing to you. Why should you care who my father is, after all? I am born of the clan of the Blue-Green Reach, and on the banks of the Sotek. That is a good thing to be. But it is nothing to you, and who would blame you? I am a champion of the Sun River Nation. I am a scion of old Crocodile, bearing a warrior soul within me, a soul from out of time. I can step into a shape you never saw, a beast of the myth times that no man ever hunted. Ah, I have your interest then. For he could feel the vast, invisible attention of the place shifting around him like great stone blocks. I have come a long way to stand before your people. You are mighty, and I am but a man. Yet I have seen sights that most of your people cannot dream of. I have seen Atalan, the beautiful, and fought pirates among the estuary islands. I have hunted with the Laughing Men, and have stood in the dead city of the Stone People.
With his eyes closed, it was easy to believe that a ring of people surrounded him, close enough to touch. Perhaps they did. Perhaps killers of the northern tribes had crept up to avenge this slight offered to their holy place. The temptation to open his eyes, to reach out for them, was like a fire under his skin. To do so would ruin everything, though.
I have earned my place here, he told the stones. I have fought sure as flint, champion of the Many-Mouths tribe, and I have sent his soul onwards to be reborn amongst the wolf packs. As who am I means nothing in this land. Recognize me for my deeds.
And he stood up smoothly, with his eyes still tight shut. One hand found the steel dagger with which he had killed sure as flint, and he drew its blade across the back of his arm, feeling the sensation as cold more than pain. He held the metal in place there, letting his blood slick it, turning it so that both sides were greasy with redness. Then he laid it on the altar.
What belongs to the crown of the world? I return to it. Take it! Take my blood! Know me and recognize me!
Stepping away, the sudden absence of that fierce pressure almost made him stumble. He felt a gathering of powers knotting with the lowering clouds above, twisting and coiling across one another. There was thunder, but it was distant as the mountains, dismissive like the shrugging of gods. Nothing struck him down. He felt no curse descend upon him. The North did not have to like him, but it had withdrawn its enmity a little, giving him some time and room. He turned and walked back to the other two, meeting none of the northern gazes that lit upon him.
Who knows?
He told them, as he made that last step, the one which took him out of the circle, out of the direct focus of the crown of the world.
Who knows what I have accomplished?
Venator twitched his head sideways pointedly, and only then did Asmander see a third figure there, lurking in the shadow of one of the stones at the outer edges of the circle. His eyes went wide when he saw what manner of man the newcomer was. A serpent priest, just about the last man Asmander would have looked for here in the cold north. An ancient serpent, his skin gone pale and brittle, gray beneath his eyes and in the hollows of his sunken cheeks crossed by the faded snakeskin tracks of his devotion. He wore horse society cast-offs, just like Asmander and his fellows, but here was a withered old man of the south, none the less.
You dare more than I would, champion of the Riverland.
The priest said softly. For a moment the hair stood up on Asmander's neck, that this man should know him and his soul so quickly. In the next, he guessed that such information had come from the loose lips of Shiri or Venator. He realized that he had tensed up, waiting for some terrible pronouncement from the old man, but the priest merely shook his head slightly.
My name is Heshbrek Eshenshkish, and I have been traveling a long time, and it is good to see faces that I recognize. Let me be a guest at your hearth, just for a brief while, and I will ask blessing of serpent for you, and then we may talk of warmer places.
It was close to midday the following day when Loud Thunder's mother finally sent for him. Lone Mountain ambled up, and Maniye wondered if the pair would start fighting again, but they just stared at each other until Thunder nodded and sloped off towards the single tent. Maniye tried to trail in his wake, but he turned and looked at her in a way that told her she was not welcome there. This was the heart of the bear's mysteries, and not for outsiders. Lone Mountain now sat down almost exactly where Thunder had been, looking as disconsolate at being kept out as the other man had been unwilling to be called in. She went and sat near him, and tried to think of some way to open a conversation. The great brooding bulk of the bears warned her off, though. They were all of them built on a different scale to her. They could smash her with a single ill-thought gesture. Then he glanced towards her, expressionless, and she blurted, "I like your robe," before she could stop herself. He grunted. A moment later, she read the sound as amusement.
I traded many skins for it to a horseman. I thought it would make me different.
She nodded warily. "Because you want—"
It is not to me she listens,
Lone Mountain said softly.
it is to the spirits, to winter and storm and the bear. In another season, in a different year, I would be enough. She would call me and tell me to become war leader, because all the wars would be small wars.
Maniye felt a curious cold feeling run down her back. "Wars?" Lone Mountain's voice dropped lower, until it became a whisper for her ears only.
Mother is old. For 10 years now, we have thought she would soon pass on and leave her human shape behind her. She is close to the spirits, as only one of so many years can be. But is she wise now, or has she gone beyond wisdom into the foolishness of age?
He was not looking at her, but talking as if to order his own thoughts.
She speaks of a great war and a time of broken laws. She says it will be soon now. She says she has looked in the sky and the water and the earth, and they tell her Loud Thunder must be war leader, or none at all.
His broad shoulders rose and fell. Maniye was peripherally aware of a low rumble of voices from within the tent, deep enough that she almost felt it through the ground. Now one voice was raised, angry and insistent, as resonant as Thunder's own, but a woman's voice none the less. Lone Mountain shifted uncomfortably. The other bear men were paying no heed, some sleeping, one feeding sticks to a fire with a child's all-consuming focus, another napping a flint with careful, measured strokes. Only Mountain himself seemed to detect the shift of mood. She had the impression that he had traveled more than the rest, spent more time with human beings of other tribes. She wondered if he had been trying to be like Loud Thunder. She could hear Thunder's slow tones sounding as though he was patiently explaining something. The other voice cut him off in mid-flow. There was nothing to the rhythm of their speech that suggested they would be finished any time soon. Maniye put a hand briefly to Lone Mountain's arm, a tiny gesture of commiseration, and then backed away from that solitary tent, seeking somewhere where the air was less taut and tense. There was quite a milling of people in the space between the fires. She saw a handful of the coyote had laid out their blankets, setting out their stock in trade. This would not be their usual goods and gear that they had hawked between villages of the crown of the world from spring to fall. Instead, here were their special wares, scrimshaw from the wetback people of the coast, translucent sharp-edged stones stolen from the earth, blades of black glass, glittering statuettes of jasper and greenstone, and shining gray false iron stone. These were trade goods fit for priests, objects of ritual, and the men and women who had brought them here were not peddlers, but votaries playing their part in the great dance between spirits and men. She watched the acolytes of a dozen tribes crouching to pore over the assembled wares, as though divining the future in that scattering of items on the blankets. Everyone here was consumed with purpose, desperate to lure the favor of the coming year. There would be propitiations and ceremonies, dancing and drums. Some would don masks, others would paint their faces. There would be promises made, and sacrifices of precious things. Perhaps the deer people would have a crowned year king whose reign was come to an end, or the Erie men a girl child clad in gold to become their messenger to the other world, or the boar would bring the makings of a god feast. Every tribe of the crown of the world had come here with its own traditions and ways, but, nevertheless, they were all seeking the same thing. Her eye lit on one particular piece amidst the ceremonial clutter. From somewhere, after how long a journey, had come to the north from a carving in a rich green stone. Its shape was foreign, a twined and knotted serpent that seemed to tunnel in and out until it had honeycombed the material that it was composed of. She knew instantly this must be Southerner work, some token of Hesprick's own faith. Although she had nothing to trade for it, she drew closer, thinking what a fine gift it would make for him. When she had squatted there long enough, knowing that she was wasting her time and yet fascinated by the delicate workmanship, she looked up and found herself staring into the eyes of Kalameshli Takes Iron. The priest of the Winter Runners had plainly noticed her in the very same moment. For a moment, they just stared. She was close enough that he could have reached out and grabbed her, and she felt every muscle tense, ready to step, ready to spring away. A terrible expression appeared on his face. It was not what she expected, not the anger that she almost demanded as her due. Here I am! I ran away! I disobeyed! She thought. But Kalameshli had only shock and alarm to offer her. It was as though she had become a figure of fear somehow for the man who had tormented all her growing years. His hands twitched, but almost to shoo her away rather than to reach for her. And then it was too late. There was another man at Kalameshli's elbow, and it was her father. Akrit Stone River saw her, and his face went dead, every vestige of him withdrawing from it and leaving her no window into his thoughts at all. He was frozen, his body battling itself, and she was still there, still caught on the very point of flight, and around them everyone else continued about their business. It was the stone place, she understood, the sacred place where no man raised a hand against another, save in the name of religion. It was as she had been told, so long as she remained here, and so long as the days of the equinox held, she was safe from the merely worldly ambitions of her father. But there was a dark and angry look coming to Stone River's face as she stared at her, and she saw Kalameshli raise his hands in warning, not touching his chief, but trying to draw his attention and tap his ire. By now, a few of the traders around them had sensed something amiss. She saw one old coyote flip his blanket over and bundle his goods away hurriedly. Girl, her father got out, come with me. She shook her head, finding that she had no words left when facing him. She remembered the weight of his hand, the quick fire of his rage, the coldness of his regard. These had been the milestones of her years. They were her memories of home and family and childhood, and she had shed them like snakeskin when she had absconded with Hesprick. You are mine, Stone River hissed. Come with me. Still, he would not actually reach for her, but his head twitched, tugging at her with his authority, demanding that she come meekly to heel. There was a word rising within her. She felt it coming, like a nauseous wave, and tried to fight it down, but it flooded her mouth with bile and forced its way out of her lips. No, she said. And then she had stepped, because she saw that word impact on Akrit Stone River's composure and tear it open. He lunged for her then, with Kalameshli calling out his name to stop him, but all he got was a handful of hairs from her tail. Then he had stepped himself and went pounding after her. And that's where we end today. Chapter 24 coming to a close, right on a big old cliffhanger. So, what do you think's going to happen? Maniye finally met back up with her father and the priest. Kalameshli takes iron. Whew, that can't be good news. Her father is quite angry. Akrit Stone River. So, will he betray the rules of the stone place, where you are to lay no hand on another human? Or will he forego all tradition and invite curses upon his head by attacking his own daughter? Who knows? Tune in again next week to find out. We'll read another 2 chapters, and I look forward to seeing you all then. But until then, enjoy your weekend and have a great day. Bye now.